The wind had a bite that gnawed straight to the bone. It howled down from the northern peaks of Montana, a predator of sound and ice, chasing the last of the daylight across the vast, unforgiving plains. Eli sat tall on his buckskin mare. The collar of his sheepskin coat turned up against the fury. The world was a stark canvas of white and gray. The snow deep enough to swallow a man whole. The sky the color of a tarnished pewter cup. It was a land that didn't care if you lived or died. And for the last 5 years, Eli hadn't much cared either. His life was a simple, brutal rhythm. Check the traps, chop the wood, hunt for meat, and endure. The solitude was a balm on a wound that would never fully heal, a quiet penance for a past he couldn't outrun. He had lost his wife, his son, and his small ranch in a blur of greed, legal papers, and a single, final gunshot that wasn't his. The town of Three Forks had turned its back, and so Eli had turned his on the whole damn world, finding a bitter sort of peace in the silence of the high country. It was the splash of color that caught his eye, a detail so wrong against the monochrome landscape that it felt like a glitch in creation. A patch of dark crimson, blooming like a morbid winter, rose against a drift of snow near a frozen creek. He urged his mare, Martha, forward, her hooves sinking with soft thuds into the powder. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't an animal. It was a woman. She was lying face down, a tangle of dark hair spilling from under a thin, worn shawl. Her dress, a cheap calico thing, was ripped and stained, utterly useless against the cold. The blood stain originated from somewhere beneath the tattered fabric of her skirt, a stark and spreading violation against the purity of the snow. She was small, barely a woman, and Eli's first thought was a grim one, another soul claimed by the unforgiving West. He dismounted, his boots crunching, the cold air stinging his lungs. He expected to find a corpse, but as he knelt, a faint puff of condensation, a ghost of breath, escaped her pale lips, and then a sound, so quiet it was nearly lost to the wind, a broken whisper. "Don't pull it, please." Eli froze, his gloved hand hovering over her shoulder. The words made no sense. He looked around. They were alone. Miles of empty. Snow-choked wilderness stretched in every direction. There was nothing to pull, no arrow shaft or knife hilt protruding from her back. There was only the cold, the wind, and the creeping shadow of dusk. He debated for less than a heartbeat. He was a man who had sworn off the troubles of others, who had built a fortress of solitude around his heart. But leaving her here was a death sentence, a kind of murder by inaction that even his calloused soul couldn't stomach. With a grunt, he carefully rolled her over. Her face was ashen, blue-tinged at the lips, and smudged with dirt. Her eyes were closed, her lashes dark against the pale skin. She was young, younger than he'd thought. A tremor ran through her body, a final, desperate shudder of a life about to be extinguished. He scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of rags and cold bones. Getting her onto the horse was a struggle, her limp body an awkward weight against his. He mounted behind her, wrapping one arm tight around her waist, her head lolling back against his chest. Martha, steady as a rock, began the slow, plodding journey back toward the smoke that curled from the stone chimney of his cabin, a lonely signal in a sea of white. The cabin was a small, sturdy thing he'd built himself, nestled in a fold of the hills where the pines offered some protection from the wind. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, the only source of warmth and light. He laid her gently on his own cot, a simple frame of wood and rope topped with a straw-stuffed mattress and a thick buffalo hide. Her breathing was shallow, her skin like ice. He worked with a grim efficiency born of long practice in self-reliance. He stoked the fire until it roared, then filled a pot with snow to melt for water. He had to get her out of the wet clothes. Using his hunting knife, he carefully sliced through the frozen, blood-caked fabric of her dress. As he pulled the rags away from her leg, the smell hit him. It was the sickly sweet odor of corruption, a scent he knew from the battlefield and from animals left too long in a trap. Beneath the tatters of her skirt and a crude bandage made of what looked like a torn flour sack, he found the source. A long, deep gash ran along the outside of her thigh. It wasn't the wound itself that shocked him, but the way it had been closed. It was stitched with thick, black thread, the stitches wide and clumsy, pulling the skin together in an angry, puckered line. The flesh around it was inflamed, a venomous red that faded to a bruised purple, and parts of the wound were weeping a foul-smelling fluid. It was a butcher's work, done in haste and desperation. He was cleaning the area with a rag dipped in hot water when her eyes flew open. They weren't hazy or unfocused. They were sharp, lucid, and filled with a terror so profound it made the hair on his arms stand up. Her hand, frail and trembling, shot out and gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "No," she rasped, her voice raw. "Don't." "The wound's gone bad," Eli said, his voice a low rumble, unused to conversation. "It needs to be cleaned properly, or you'll lose the leg, or your life." "You don't understand," she pleaded, her eyes darting from his face to the wound and back again. She tried to sit up, a wave of pain and dizziness forcing her back down. "If you take it off, if you undo the stitches, I'll die. I swear to you, I'll die, and not from the wound." Eli stared at her, dumbfounded. The woman was delirious with fever. That had to be it. Yet the fear in her eyes felt chillingly sane. It was primal, the look of a cornered animal that knows the hunter is closing in. "Just rest," he said, gently pulling his wrist from her grasp. "I'm not going to hurt you." He kept his distance after that, for her sake and his own. He brewed a weak broth from dried venison and managed to get a few spoonfuls into her. She drank thirstily but refused to speak further. When he asked her name, she hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the cabin's single, shuttered window, as if expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. "You can call me May," she finally whispered, and he knew it was a lie as surely as he knew his own name. The days that followed fell into a tense, quiet routine. The blizzard descended in full, locking them inside, the wind shrieking like a banshee through the pines. Eli tended the fire, checked on May, and spent long hours staring into the flames, the unexpected presence in his home a constant, unsettling disruption. She drifted in and out of a fevered sleep, sometimes muttering the same broken plea he'd first heard in the snow. She was a ghost at his hearth, a mystery wrapped in rags. When she was awake, she watched his every move, her body coiled with a tension that never eased. She was weak, yet her spirit was a raw, exposed nerve. He had seen fear before, but this was different. This was a fear that had been lived with, breathed in. For so long it had become a part of her very being. He saw the echoes of his own loss in her haunted eyes. He, too, was a hunted thing, pursued not by men with guns, but by memories that stalked him in the quiet hours. He had built this life of isolation to keep those ghosts at bay, and now, this woman had brought the outside world, with all its violence and pain, crashing back into his sanctuary. They circled each other with the wariness of two wounded wolves, thrown together by chance in a hostile world. An unspoken truce existed in the space between them. He wouldn't press her for answers she was too terrified to give, and she, in turn, seemed to understand that he meant her no immediate harm. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the small, fire-lit room, a flicker of shared understanding, a recognition of the deep hurt that lay beneath the surface. He saw the gash on her leg, but he was beginning to understand it was just a physical manifestation of a far deeper, more terrifying injury, one that had been stitched closed with secrets and fear, and he had a sinking feeling that to truly heal one, he would have to unravel the other. For 3 days, the storm raged, a relentless assault of wind and snow that seemed intent on scouring the mountains clean of all life. It imprisoned them in the small cabin, the world outside reduced to a howling white void. Inside, a different kind of storm was gathering. May's fever, which had been a low, smoldering fire, now erupted into a conflagration. Her skin was scorching to the touch, yet she shivered violently beneath the heavy buffalo hide. Her moments of lucidity grew shorter, replaced by delirious muttering and a glassy, vacant stare. The foul odor from her wound intensified, a pervasive scent of decay that clung to the air and turned Eli's stomach. He knew, with the grim certainty of a man who had seen death in many forms, that he was out of time. Her pleas to leave the wound alone had been born of fear, but the infection spreading through her veins was a more immediate and tangible predator. It would claim her before whatever she was running from ever could. The choice had been made for him. He waited until the fever peaked. When she was tossing her head back and forth on the straw pillow, her lips cracked and dry, he honed his sharpest skinning knife on a whetstone until the edge was keen enough to shave with, then held the blade in the fire, the steel glowing a dull orange. He boiled water in the cast-iron pot, tearing strips from one of his own few clean shirts to serve as fresh bandages. He moved with a heavy heart, the task ahead of him a brutal necessity. "May," he said, his voice low and firm. She didn't respond, lost in her fever dream. He gently but resolutely pinned her leg down with one hand. "This has to be done." With the tip of the hot knife, he carefully snipped the first of the thick, black stitches. A bead of dark, foul-smelling fluid welled up. May cried out, a thin, pained sound, and her body arched in protest. But he held her steady, one by one. He cut the crude sutures, his jaw tight with concentration. The work was slow and ugly. The person who had done this had sewn her up like a feed sack, with no care for the living flesh they were piercing. As he pulled the last of the thread free, he used a clean rag to peel back the swollen edges of the wound. And then he saw it. What lay beneath the putrid bandage was far worse than just a festering cut. First, there was the mark, faded and blurred by the inflammation of her skin, but still unmistakable. Inked into her flesh was a circle of what looked like barbed wire, a crude, ugly brand just above the gash. It was a mark of ownership, stark and cruel. But it was the second discovery that made his blood run cold, as he cleaned the wound, flushing it with whiskey that made her scream. His fingers brushed against something hard and thin, lodged deep in the tissue. Carefully, he worked it free from the corrupted flesh. It was a tiny, delicate chain of woven silver, no thicker than a piece of twine. It had been deliberately placed inside the cut, and the wound had been stitched over it, hiding it, sealing it within her. It wasn't an accident. It was a secret someone had tried to bury inside her own body. This wasn't just a wound. It was a desecration. The shock of the whiskey and the pain of his probing finally broke through her fever. Her eyes focused on him, then dropped to her leg, to the ugly brand and the small, bloodied silver chain he now held between his thumb and forefinger. A sound escaped her, a choked, hopeless sob that held no tears. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, replaced by a terrifying, absolute despair. She began to tremble, her whole body shaking with silent, racking tremors. "If they know I'm alive," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound against the roar of the wind outside. "They'll come back. They'll find me." Eli's hands stopped their work. He looked from the chain to her face, and the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place with sickening clarity. The desperate flight, the strange plea in the snow, the constant, hunted fear in her eyes. She wasn't just a victim of some random frontier violence. She was a witness. She was an escapee. He set the chain aside and went back to cleaning the wound, his movements now gentler, more deliberate. "Who are they?" he asked, keeping his voice even, calm, a rock in the storm of her terror. For a long time, she said nothing, the only sound her ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire. He thought she wouldn't answer, but then, as he began to apply a poultice of herbs, Her story spilled out of her in a broken, halting whisper. She spoke of the South, of a group that called themselves the Congregation of the New Dawn. They traveled from town to town, putting on the guise of a devout, charitable mission. They took in orphans, runaways, girls with no family and no prospects. They promised food, shelter, a place in God's light. But beneath the veneer of piety, it was a lie. It was a market. The girls were chattel, sold and traded to powerful men who paid for silence and secrecy. May had been one of them for years, trapped since she was a child. The barbed wire circle was their mark, a brand for their flock. The silver chain, she explained, was a key to a lockbox where the leader, a man they called the shepherd, kept his ledgers, names, dates, payments, proof of every sin. She had stolen it, hidden it inside a cut on her leg, and run. There was a little one, May whispered, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames, seeing things he couldn't. Her name was Sarah, no more than 8 years old. She saw the shepherd with the mayor from a town in Kansas. She didn't understand what she was seeing, but she spoke of it. The next day, they said she had been taken by a fever. May's voice broke. There was no fever. He silenced her. I knew I was next, so I ran. A cold, hard rage began to smolder in Eli's gut. It was an old, familiar feeling, an anger he thought he had buried years ago with his wife and son. It was the fury of a man who sees the strong prey on the weak, the corrupt feast on the innocent. He looked at this small, broken woman on his cot, and he saw not just her, but a whole world of cruelty he had tried to escape. But a colder, more practical thought followed immediately behind the anger. He had chosen this life for a reason. He had cut himself off to avoid this very kind of trouble. This congregation wasn't some backwoods gang of thugs. They were organized, powerful, and hid behind the shield of religion. The kind of men who would kill a child to protect their secrets, would not hesitate to hunt down one girl and the lonely man who gave her shelter. To help her was to declare war. It was to invite the violence and chaos he had fled right to his doorstep. He would be putting his life, the bitter, empty life he had clung to, on the line. That night, the storm reached its zenith. The cabin groaned under the weight of the wind and snow. Eli sat in his chair by the hearth, the rifle across his lap, listening to the storm both outside and inside his own mind. Sleep was impossible. Suddenly, May cried out. It wasn't the low moan of pain, but a sharp, piercing shriek of pure terror. She was thrashing on the cot, caught in the grips of a nightmare, her hands flailing as if to ward off an unseen attacker. No! Get away from me! Please, no! Without thinking, without weighing the risks or consequences, Eli moved. He was at her side in 2 strides, setting his rifle down. He sat on the edge of the cot and put his hands on her shoulders. She was still fighting, lost in the horror of her memory. He did the only thing he could think to do. He gathered her up, pulling her trembling body against his chest, holding her tight. You're safe, he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. It's just a dream. I'm here. You're safe now. He held her like that for a long time, her frantic struggles slowly subsiding into deep, shuddering sobs. She clung to his shirt, her face buried against his shoulder. He could feel the fragile beat of her heart against his ribs, the warmth of her breath through the coarse wool of his shirt. He was holding a stranger, a harbinger of untold danger. But in that moment, she wasn't a stranger. She was a terrified human being, and he was her only shield against the darkness. And as he sat there in the dimly lit cabin, the blizzard howling its fury outside, Eli knew the debate was over. The walls he had so carefully constructed around his frozen heart had been irrevocably breached. He had felt the tremor of her fear, offered the comfort of his arms. The choice had been made the moment he lifted her from the snow, and every moment since had only sealed it. He was too late to turn back. Her war was now his. The blizzard broke as suddenly as it had begun. leaving the world scoured and pristine under a brittle blue sky. The snow lay in immense, sculpted drifts, and the silence was so profound it seemed to have a weight of its own. Inside the cabin, a different kind of quiet had settled. May's fever was gone, and the angry red around her wound had begun to recede, leaving behind clean, healing flesh. Eli had removed the silver chain and tucked it safely into a small leather pouch. He had cleaned the ugly, branded tattoo until it was raw, as if he could somehow wash away the memory of what it represented. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was her guardian, a role he accepted with a grim reluctance that felt more like fate than choice. They moved around each other in the confined space with a practiced economy of motion, a silent dance of survival. He taught her how to set a snare, and she showed him how to properly mend a tear in his coat, her small, nimble fingers working the needle with a surprising deftness. Yet, an invisible wall remained between them, built of his caution and her deep-seated fear. The shadows in her eyes had not receded with the fever. The last of his laudanum was gone, and his supply of salt and flour was dwindling. The town of Three Forks was a place he avoided, a place full of ghosts and judging eyes. But necessity was a harsh master. He had to go. "I'll be back before nightfall," he announced. Pulling on his heavy coat, he saw a flicker of panic in her eyes, the familiar look of a doe that hears a twig snap in the forest. "Don't leave me," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I have to," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. For any reason. Fire the rifle if you have to." He left the Winchester propped against the wall near the hearth, a cold promise of protection. The ride to town was jarring, the sunlight glittering off the snow with a blinding intensity. Three Forks hadn't changed. It was a single muddy street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that clung to the edge of civilization by its fingernails. As he tethered Martha outside the general store, he felt the familiar weight of scrutiny. He was the hermit from the hills, the man with a tragic past. His presence was an anomaly, a disruption to the town's dull rhythm. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and damp wool. Silas Henderson, the proprietor, a man whose face was a roadmap of sour disappointments, gave him a curt nod. "Eli, been a while. Thought maybe a bear got you." "Not yet," Eli rumbled, handing over his list. As Silas gathered the supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and a small, precious bottle of carbolic acid for cleaning the wound, his eyes fell on the sleeve of Eli's coat. A dark, rust-colored stain marred the sheepskin. "Looks like you had some trouble," Silas noted, his curiosity poorly veiled. "Sloppy work dressing a deer," Eli lied, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. He was about to pay when another man stepped up to the counter. He was a stranger, which was rare enough in Three Forks, but it was his appearance that set Eli on edge. While everyone else wore the practical, trail-worn clothes of the frontier, this man's coat was clean, his boots polished. He looked like a preacher or a lawman, but his eyes were neither pious nor just. They were cold, watchful, and deeply unsettling. "Pardon the intrusion," the stranger said, his voice smooth and even. He nodded at Eli. "A hard winter we're having." Eli just grunted in response, taking his parcel from Silas. "I'm just passing through," the man continued, his gaze lingering on Eli. "Looking for someone, you might say, a young woman who came into some trouble. Heard she might have headed up this way, a runaway." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "A troubled soul, with a particular mark, a tattoo." Eli's blood turned to ice. He kept his face impassive, his eyes locked on the man's. He could feel the weight of the silver chain in his pocket. A cold, hard secret. "Don't know anyone like that," Eli said, his voice flat. "I keep to myself." He dropped the coins on the counter, grabbed his supplies, and walked out without another word, the stranger's calculating gaze burning into his back. He didn't look back. He untied Martha, mounted, and rode out of town, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. The threat was no longer a vague monster from May's past. It had a face, a voice, and it was here. He pushed the mare hard on the way back, his mind racing. The sun was already dipping below the jagged peaks when he saw the cabin, and his heart stopped. The door was ajar, and a single set of small footprints led away from it, heading unsteadily into the vast, snow-covered wilderness. A raw, primal fear, sharper than any he had felt for himself, seized him. He galloped the last 100 yards and leaped from the saddle before Martha had even come to a full stop. He followed the tracks, his long strides eating up the distance. He found her less than a quarter-mile away, struggling through a deep drift, her thin coat and worn boots no match for the punishing cold. She was stumbling, near exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged, white plumes. He grabbed her arm, spinning her around. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he roared, his voice rough with a fury born of terror. She flinched, her face pale and streaked with tears. "I heard you ride in," she choked out. "I had to go. They're looking for me. That man in town, he'll find you. I won't let them kill you because of me." "You think dying out here in the snow is better?" he yelled, shaking her slightly. "Running into the wilderness with no food, no shelter? That's not courage, that's foolishness." Her face crumpled, and the words that came out were a raw, agonizing cry from the depths of her soul. "I'm not worth dying for," she wept, her body sagging in his grip. "Don't you understand? I'm nothing. I'm spoiled. It's better if I just disappear." Her words struck him silent, extinguishing his anger like a bucket of water on a campfire. He saw the truth of her conviction in her eyes, the absolute, soul-deep belief that she was worthless. It was the most brutal wound of all, the one the shepherd and his kind had carved into her spirit. And then he did something he couldn't explain, an act born of desperation and a raging, helpless need to prove her wrong. He pulled her to him and crushed his mouth against hers. It wasn't a kiss of tenderness or romance. It was a kiss of raw, desperate force, a frantic attempt to silence the lies she believed, to brand her with a different kind of truth. It was a collision, a desperate clash of his frustration and her despair. He felt a violent tremor run through her, a shudder that had nothing to do with the cold. He pulled back instantly, his breath ragged. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and a familiar, heart-wrenching fear. He had meant to comfort, to claim, but he had only frightened her more. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Without a word, he lifted her into his arms and carried her back to the cabin. The silence between them was heavy, charged with the aftermath of their raw emotions. He barred the door, stoked the fire until it blazed, and sat her down on the hearth. That night, the unspoken tension had shifted, after they ate in silence. He laid her bedroll closer to the fire, then unrolled his own right beside it, leaving only a foot of space between them. It wasn't a proposition, it was a statement. Asterisk. You are not alone. They lay there for hours, staring into the embers, the only sounds the sigh of the wind in the chimney and the soft rhythm of their own breathing, in the deep, warm darkness. He felt her hand hesitantly inch across the floorboards until her fingers brushed against his. He met her touch, his rough, calloused hand enveloping her small one. "I had a sister," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost a part of the fire's crackle. "Her name was Lily. She was younger than me." He felt her fingers tremble in his. "She got sick, a lung fever. The shepherd. He said prayer was the only medicine she needed. I begged him to let me fetch a doctor. He locked me in a cellar for 2 days for my lack of faith." Her voice broke. "When he let me out, she was gone. I promised her I would always protect her. I failed. That's who I am. Eli. Someone who fails the people she loves." He squeezed her hand, a silent denial of her words. He turned his head on his saddlebag pillow and looked at her, in the flickering golden light of the dying fire. He saw her, truly saw her. Not the frightened runaway, not the victim, not the burden. He saw May, a woman who had endured the unimaginable and was still fighting, still feeling, still hoping not to be the cause of any more pain. She met his gaze, and for the first time, the terror in her eyes was gone. In its place was something new, something fragile and luminous and incredibly brave. It was the faint, glimmering dawn of trust. And in that shared look, in the dark heart of the Montana winter, a connection was forged, as real and binding as any vow. The dawn brought with it a fragile truce between them. The confession in the dark had changed the air in the cabin, replacing some of the tension with a delicate, unspoken tenderness. But Eli knew this small shelter was a temporary reprieve, not a solution. The man in town was a clear sign that May's hunters were not just specters from her past. They were a real and present threat. His solitude was no longer a shield. It was a trap. He had only one person he could trust, a man who lived 5 miles down the valley, a man as broken by the world as he was. "We're leaving," he said as he doused the morning fire. "Just for a while. There's someone I want you to meet." He saddled Martha and helped May up behind him. She settled herself cautiously, her arms circling his waist, her body a warm, hesitant presence against his back. The contact was new, intimate, and sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with the morning chill. As they rode, he was acutely aware of every shift of her weight, the soft puff of her breath against his neck. Josiah's smithy was a dark, cavernous building that seemed to have sprouted from the rocky ground itself, its stone walls stained black with the soot of 1,000 fires. The rhythmic clang of a hammer on anvil rang out as they approached, a steady, metallic heartbeat in the quiet valley. Josiah was a bear of a man, with a wild gray beard and arms corded with muscle from a lifetime of shaping iron. He was a widower, a veteran of the war, and the only man Eli had spoken more than a dozen words to in the last 5 years. He stopped hammering as they entered, his eyes sharp and intelligent under bushy brows, taking in the scene. Eli, the hermit, with a strange, haunted-looking young woman in tow. He wiped a sweaty hand on his leather apron, his gaze hard and questioning. "Eli," Josiah said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Didn't figure you for company." "This is May," Eli said, skipping the pleasantries. "She's in trouble. Josiah, the kind you and I have seen before. She needs a safe place to stay for a time, a place no one would think to look." Josiah's eyes narrowed as he studied May. She shrank back under his intense scrutiny, pulling her thin coat tighter around herself. He saw the healing gash on her leg where her dress was slightly hitched up, and his gaze lingered there for a moment. "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that follows a person," Eli answered evasively. "I'm no charity, Eli. I've got my own peace to keep." Josiah grumbled, but he didn't refuse. He looked at May again, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. He was a man who knew loss. "She can stay in the loft, but any trouble she brings, she takes with her when she leaves." He then looked straight at May. "Girl, you bring a fight to my door. You best know how to use a gun." Later, while May rested in the small, hay-filled loft above the forge, Eli showed Josiah the brand on her leg. He didn't have to. The old blacksmith had already seen it. "Saw a mark like that once," Josiah said quietly, staring into the glowing heart of his forge. "Down on the Cimarron Strip, years ago, a group came through, calling themselves the Congregation of the New Dawn, all smiles and scripture. But there were whispers. Folks said they held strange ceremonies out in the canyons at night, said young folk who joined were never seen again. They were run out of the territory after a deputy who started asking questions was found with his throat cut." He picked up his hammer, his knuckles white. "I thought it was just talk. Seems the talk was true." He looked at Eli, his eyes grim. "You know what you're stepping into, son? This ain't some range dispute. These are fanatics, vipers hiding behind a cross." Eli felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "I know," he said, his own voice sounding distant, A part of him, the sensible, self-preserving part that had kept him alive this long, was screaming at him to ride away, to take May deep into the mountains and never look back. But another part, a part he thought had died with his family, felt a stubborn, dangerous resolve taking root. He was stepping into an abyss, and he knew it. But for the first time in years, he wasn't sure he wanted to turn back. He stayed for 2 days, helping Josiah with his work, the familiar labor of the forge a comfort to his troubled mind. He watched May from a distance. She was quiet, helping Josiah's wife's old vegetable garden, her movements still timid but with a growing sense of purpose. She was healing, not just her leg, but in the small, incremental ways a wildflower finds a crack in a rock to grow. On the afternoon of the second day, he found her by the creek. "Let's go for a ride," he said. It wasn't a question. He took her up the winding trail that led to the high ridges overlooking the valley. The higher they climbed, the more the wind picked up, a wild, clean thing that whipped her hair across her face and seemed to blow the shadows from her eyes. He reined Martha in at a place he knew, a shallow cave carved out of the rock face by eons of wind and ice. From here, the world spread out below them, a breathtaking tapestry of dark green forest, white-capped peaks, and the silver ribbon of the river. They stood in silence for a long time, the wind tearing at their clothes. It was a place that made a man's troubles feel small and insignificant. He looked at her profile etched against the vast, empty sky, and a feeling of fierce, protective tenderness washed over him. She turned to face him, her eyes clear and impossibly deep. The fear was gone, replaced by a raw, open vulnerability that mirrored his own. This time, when he reached for her, she did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, her cold hands coming up to cup his jaw. The kiss was nothing like the first one. It was not born of desperation or anger. It was a slow, deliberate claiming, a fusion of longing and discovery. It was the taste of the cold wind and the warmth of a shared breath. It was a question and an answer, a beginning and an end to all the loneliness that had come before. It deepened, becoming hungry, urgent, a raw expression of the elemental forces that had thrown them together. He led her back into the shelter of the small cave, away from the biting wind. There, on the cold stone floor, with the world spread out at their feet, they came together. It was a frantic, desperate collision of two solitary souls. It was the slide of cold skin against the heat of a fevered chest, the gasp of breath in the thin mountain air, the silent language of eyes that looked at each other and saw not a stranger, but a reflection of their own broken, beating heart. For a few brief, breathless moments, there were no hunters, no past, no fear, only the visceral, undeniable truth of their bodies entwined, a desperate, defiant act of life against the encroaching darkness. As the sun bled its last orange and purple light across the horizon, they held each other, their ragged breaths mingling in the twilight, two small points of warmth against the immense cold of the world. They rode back to the smithy in a profound, altered silence. The world felt different, sharper, the colors more vivid. That night, lying in the darkness of the loft, a new, unspoken intimacy enveloped them. But just as a fragile peace began to settle in his soul, a sound split the night. It was distant, but unmistakable. The sharp crack of a rifle shot, echoing through the silent, frozen forest. It was followed by another. The sound was a violation, a brutal intrusion into the quiet of the valley. The peace was shattered. The darkness was no longer empty. It was watching. The rifle shots had stripped the peace from the valley, leaving behind a ringing silence that was more menacing than the noise itself. Eli didn't sleep. He sat in the dark of Josiah's smithy, his Winchester across his knees, listening. Before the first hint of gray light touched the sky, he was outside with the old blacksmith, circling the property, and there, in a patch of snow sheltered by a dense copse of aspens, they found them. The tracks were nearly invisible, left by someone who knew how to move through the wilderness without being seen. They weren't the deep, clumsy prints of a townsman. These were the marks of moccasins, or boots wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound. They were the tracks of hunters. 2 men, at least. They hadn't come for the deer. They had been watching the smithy, gauging its defenses, waiting. The shots in the night hadn't been a warning. They had been a signal. "They know she's here," Josiah said, his voice a low growl. He spat a wad of tobacco onto the snow. Or they suspected enough to come sniffing around. Eli's jaw was a hard line. "They won't wait long." "You can't stay." Josiah stated the obvious. "They'll come in force next time." "I know a place," Eli said, his mind already racing north. "The Black Hills. There are canyons there. Old cliff dwellings the Ute used to use. A man could disappear for a lifetime if he knew where to look." Josiah nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Eli's. An understanding passed between the 2 men, the unspoken pact of soldiers who knew the cost of a fight. "I'll buy you time," the blacksmith said. "Ride out through the North Pass. I'll take my horse and lead a false trail west. Draw 'em off your scent." "Josiah, you don't have to—" "I know what I have to do." The old man cut him off, his voice like grinding stone. "That girl, she's got the look of a trapped thing. I spent a winter in a Confederate prison camp. I know that look. Now get her ready and ride like hell is on your heels." There was no time for lengthy goodbyes. Eli threw supplies into 2 saddlebags: dried meat, hardtack, ammunition, and the small bottle of carbolic acid. He found May in the loft, already awake, her eyes wide with a terror that confirmed she'd understood the meaning of the gunshots as well as they had. "We have to run," he said simply. She nodded, her face pale, and scrambled down the ladder without a word. Josiah pressed a heavy Colt revolver into her hands. "You know how to use this?" May looked at the weapon, then at the old man, and gave a single, firm nod. A flicker of something hard and resilient glinted in her eyes. They mounted Martha, May clinging tight behind Eli, the rifle scabbarded at his side. "Godspeed, Eli," Josiah said, clapping him on the shoulder. He turned and strode toward his own horse, a big, powerful roan, carrying his own rifle. He didn't look back. They rode hard, pushing Martha through the deep snow of the North Pass, the icy air burning their lungs. The landscape was a treacherous maze of snow-laden pines and jagged rocks. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a pursuing whisper. Eli's senses were stretched taut, his eyes scanning the ridgelines, his ears straining for any sound that was out of place. The ambush came where the pass narrowed, a tight bottleneck between a sheer rock face and a steep, wooded drop-off. It began not with a shout, but with the whining hiss of a bullet slicing the air an inch from Eli's head, followed instantly by the deafening crack of a rifle. Martha shrieked and reared, nearly throwing them. Eli fought her for control, pulling his own Winchester free as 2 figures emerged from the trees on the ridge above them. Another shot rang out, kicking up a spray of snow and rock chips from the cliff beside them. They were pinned down, exposed. "Get off! Get into the rocks!" Eli yelled, sliding from the saddle and pulling May down with him. He shoved her toward a cluster of boulders, his body shielding hers. He fired 2 quick shots toward the ridge, not to hit, but to suppress, to give them a second to breathe. Then, from further down the pass, came the thunderous boom of Josiah's big-bore rifle. The old blacksmith had circled back. He hadn't laid a false trail at all. He'd set up his own ambush to cover their retreat. "Damn fool," Eli breathed, a mix of gratitude and horror churning in his gut. "Go, Eli! Get the girl out of here!" Josiah's voice roared, echoing off the canyon walls, followed by another shot and the satisfying thud of a bullet hitting flesh. One of the men on the ridge cried out and fell from view. The remaining man returned fire, concentrating his shots on Josiah's position. It was the opening they needed. "Now, May, run!" Eli yelled, grabbing her hand. They scrambled over the rocks, half sliding, half falling down the steep embankment on the other side of the pass. plunging into the thick, concealing forest. Behind them! The gunfight raged. The sharp crack of the attacker's rifle against the methodical, heavy boom of Josiah's. And then there was a different sound, a wet, sickening thud, followed by a cry of pain that was cut short. Then, silence. A profound, terrible silence that was worse than the gunfire. Eli didn't have to look back. He knew. He pulled May deeper into the forest, his heart a block of ice in his chest. They ran until their lungs were on fire and their legs screamed in protest, not stopping until the sounds of the pass were completely gone, replaced by the hushed whisper of the wind in the high pines. He found a deep ravine, a scar in the earth shielded by a thick overhang of rock and snow-heavy spruce branches. He practically threw May inside, then collapsed beside her, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The cost of their escape was a debt that could never be repaid. Josiah, the grizzled old soldier, had made his last stand. For them. For her. May was trembling, her body racked with silent, violent shudders. Her face was buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She was coming apart, the fragile composure she had built over the last few days shattering into a million pieces. "It's my fault," she whispered, the words muffled by her hands. "It's all my fault. He's dead because of me. You'll be next." "Stop it," Eli said, his voice raw. "This isn't on you. This is on them." "You don't understand," she cried, her head snapping up. Her eyes were wild with a grief and a self-loathing so profound it was terrifying to behold. "You don't know what I am, what they made me." And then, in a torrent of broken, agonized words, the final, ugliest secret came spilling out. It wasn't just that she was a witness. It was that she had been the seal on their most important secret. A local mayor had discovered the truth about their operation. To buy his silence, the shepherd hadn't used gold. He had used her. She spoke of a secret, blasphemous ceremony in the dead of night, of being dressed in white like a bride. She described being forced into what the shepherd called a sacred covenant, a sacrificial marriage to the mayor, a binding ritual designed to make him a complicit partner in their sins, ensuring he would never speak of what he knew. It was a chain, not of silver, but of shared corruption. And she had been the central link. The act was their guarantee, their seal of silence. Eli listened, his face carved from stone, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. The sheer, calculated evil of it was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The cold fury he had felt before was nothing compared to the white-hot rage that now consumed him. It wasn't just a brand on her skin. They had tried to brand her very soul. He saw the shame that was destroying her, the belief that she was tainted, ruined beyond repair. He saw her bracing for his disgust, his rejection. She expected him to turn away, to leave her in this ravine, a thing too soiled to touch. Instead, he reached for her. He pulled her hands away from her face and gripped her arms, forcing her to look at him. His eyes burned with an intensity that cut through her despair. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce, each word a vow. "That was not a marriage. That was not a choice. That was a cage they put you in. It has no hold on you." He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her shaking body, a shield of solid warmth and unyielding strength. He could feel the frantic, terrified flutter of her heart against his own. "You don't belong to them," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "You are not their secret. You are not their sacrifice." He tilted her chin up, his gaze locking with hers. "You're the one I've chosen to keep." The Black Hills were a different kind of wilderness, older and more secretive than the open plains of Montana. They were a labyrinth of granite spires, shadowy canyons, and dense pine forests that swallowed the light. Eli found the place he was looking for, a shallow, wind-scoured cave tucked high on a cliff face, its mouth almost perfectly concealed by a gnarled, ancient juniper tree. The Ute had used this place centuries ago. Faint charcoal pictographs of bison and stick-figured hunters adorned the back wall. Ghosts of an older, harder time. It was a place to disappear. For days, they lived like shadows, their world shrinking to the confines of the cave and the small, precarious ledge outside. The weather turned, a biting, relentless wind sweeping down from the north, driving fine, hard pellets of snow before it. Survival became a series of stark, brutal tasks. Eli would venture out at dawn and dusk, his movements cautious and furtive, to check the few snares he'd set, returning with a scrawny rabbit or nothing at all. May would tend the small, smokeless fire they built deep in the cave, the fuel for it painstakingly gathered from dead, dry branches broken from the underside of trees. Their supplies dwindled with alarming speed. The hardtack was reduced to a handful of crumbs, the dried venison to a few tough strips. They grew thin, their faces becoming gaunt, their eyes large and dark in the firelight. The cold was a constant, gnawing presence, seeping through their worn clothes and bedding, making their joints ache and their sleep shallow and fitful. But in the crucible of this hardship, something new was forged between them. The last of their secrets had been spilled in the ravine, and with them, the last of their pretenses. There was no room for walls or wariness in the close confines of the cave. They were stripped down to their essential selves, two human beings clinging to life against a hostile world. The shared trauma of Josiah's death was a silent, ever-present third occupant of the cave, a debt of blood that bound them together more tightly than any vow. They spoke little, but their silence was not empty. It was filled with a profound, intuitive understanding. A shared look across the fire was enough to communicate fear, hope, or exhaustion. The simple act of him handing her a cup of hot, weak tea made from pine needles, or her mending a tear in his glove with a fishbone needle and a thread pulled from her own hem, became gestures of immense tenderness. They moved around each other with a fluid grace, their bodies learning each other's rhythms, their lives intertwined in the simple, desperate dance of staying alive. One night, the wind howled with a particular fury, rattling the old juniper tree and driving snow into the mouth of the cave. They had eaten the last of the rabbit that evening, a meager meal that did little to quell the deep, aching hunger in their bellies. The fire was little more than a pile of glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows on the ancient pictographs. The future had shrunk to a single point, the coming dawn, and whether it would bring food or starvation, safety or discovery. They lay side by side under the thin blankets and the buffalo hide, their bodies huddled together for warmth, in the deep, resonant silence between gusts of wind. Eli could hear the soft, steady beat of her heart. He turned, and in the faint, red glow of the embers, he saw that her eyes were open, watching him. There was no fear in her gaze, no shame, only a deep, desolate sadness that mirrored his own. He reached out, his rough hand tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut, a soft sigh escaping her lips. In that moment, they both knew that they had nothing left to lose. Their pasts were gone, their futures uncertain, and all they had was this single, precarious point in time, this shared breath in the darkness. What happened next was not born of passion, but of a deeper, more elemental need. It was a quiet, desperate communion of two souls who had been stripped of everything but each other. It was a silent vow made not with words, but with a raw and trembling honesty. His kiss was not demanding, but a gentle, searching question. Her response was not one of surrender, but of an equal, answering need. They gave each other the only thing they had left, themselves. It was an act of profound and tender defiance against the cold, the hunger, and the men who hunted them. It was a fierce, gentle claiming, a stripping away of the last vestiges of loneliness. In the deep cold of the cave, their bodies created a desperate, sacred warmth. It was a prayer whispered in a language of touch and breath, a raw and beautiful rite of survival. They were not just a man and a woman. They were the last two people on Earth, finding a final, fleeting solace in the ruins of their world. The morning broke clear and cold, the sky a pale, unforgiving blue. Eli awoke first. May was asleep in his arms, her face soft and unguarded in the dawn light. He looked at her, at the faint brand on her leg, at the new, peaceful lines around her mouth, and something inside him shifted, a piece of his soul, long frozen and dormant, finally and irrevocably thawed. He had spent 5 years running. He had fled from grief, from injustice, from the world of men. He had built a fortress of solitude and called it peace. But it had been a lie. It was a long, slow death. May had brought him back to life, and Josiah's sacrifice had shown him the cost of that life, lying there, with May's warmth against him. He knew he could not run anymore. Hiding in this cave was just another form of waiting to die. It was not enough to save her. He had to fight for her. He had to tear out the evil that had poisoned her life by the roots, so that she would never have to look over her shoulder again. He carefully slipped out from under the blankets and added the last of their wood to the embers, coaxing them back to a small flame. When May awoke, she saw the new look in his eyes. The quiet, watchful patience was gone, replaced by a hard, unyielding resolve. "I'm going back," he said, his voice calm and steady. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Back where?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. A knot of fear tightened in her stomach. "To Three Forks," he said. "This doesn't end by hiding in a cave. May, it ends when they can't hunt you anymore. It ends when their whole rotten enterprise is brought out into the light for everyone to see." The color drained from her face. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Eli, no, you can't. They'll kill you. It's what they do. They'll kill you, and then they'll find me." She scrambled to her feet, her voice rising with panic. "We can go further north, into the territories. We can disappear. Please, Eli, don't go." Tears streamed down her face, the raw terror she had held at bay for so long flooding back. He stood and walked to her, taking her trembling hands in his. He did not waver. He looked into her terrified eyes, and his own were filled with a strength she had never seen before. It was the strength of a man who had finally found a reason not just to survive, but to live. "I spent years running from a fight I couldn't win," he said, his voice low and certain. "This is a fight we can win, for you, for Josiah, for that little girl, Sarah." "I can't lose you," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I can't be alone again." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. "You won't be," he said, his voice a firm, unbreakable promise against her hair. He tilted her head back, forcing her to meet his gaze. This time, he was the rock. He was the shield. "I will not let you run anymore." The journey back to Three Forks was a grim pilgrimage. Eli left May hidden in a well-concealed shelter a mile out of town, with strict instructions not to move until he returned. He gave her the revolver, keeping the Winchester for himself, as he rode the last stretch alone, the memory of his last visit, the stranger's cold eyes, the urgency of his retreat, was a stark warning. But he pushed it aside. He was no longer running. He was returning to the one place a man was supposed to be able to find justice, the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody Miller was a man Eli had known for 20 years. They had ridden together on a posse once, and Miller had offered his condolences, however hollow they felt at the time. After Eli's family was gone, he was a part of the town's foundation, a man whose silver star was meant to be a symbol of order and law in a lawless land. Eli was staking his and May's lives on that symbol being true. He found Miller in his office, boots propped on his desk, cleaning a peacemaker. He looked up as Eli entered, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was a practiced, political smile. "Eli, well, I'll be twice in 1 week. The mountains must be getting crowded, Miller said, setting his pistol down. What can I do for you? Run out of coffee again? It's about Josiah, Eli said, his voice flat. He watched the sheriff's eyes for a flicker of something. Surprise, concern, anything. He saw nothing. It was like looking at a calm, deep pool of water. What about him? Miller asked, his smile not wavering. He's dead, murdered, ambushed up in the North Pass a few days back. Miller's smile finally faded, replaced by a mask of stern concern. He swung his boots to the floor. Murdered? By who? Indians? Road agents? Neither, Eli said, his hand resting near the butt of his own holstered pistol. It was the men who were in your town last week, the ones looking for a girl with a tattoo. The sheriff's face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. I heard about that fellow, a bounty hunter. I was told, looking for a thief. He was no bounty hunter, and she's no thief, Eli said, the cold dread in his gut beginning to solidify into certainty. They're part of a group called the Congregation of the New Dawn, and they're not just looking for her. Brody, they're cleaning up their loose ends. The office door creaked open. Eli turned, his hand tensing, and his blood ran cold. It was the stranger from the general store. He wasn't dressed like a preacher today. He wore a gun belt, and his hand rested on the handle of his pistol with a familiar ease. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, a faint, predatory smile on his lips. It seems our friend from the hills has a story to tell. Sheriff, the stranger said, his smooth voice dripping with menace. Eli turned back to Miller. The sheriff's face was no longer a mask. The pretense had fallen away, revealing the cold, hard corruption beneath. The star on his chest was a lie. He was one of them. You should have stayed in your hole, Eli, Miller said, his voice losing its folksy drawl, becoming flat and deadly. You had a quiet life. No one to bother you. Josiah was your friend, Eli said, his voice a low growl of disbelief. Josiah was a nosy old man who should have learned to mind his own business, Miller retorted. Before Eli could react, the sheriff's hand blurred, grabbing the heavy inkwell from his desk and hurling it. Eli ducked instinctively, but the stranger was already moving. The butt of a pistol crashed down on the back of his skull, and the world exploded in a flash of white-hot pain before dissolving into blackness. From her hiding place in a thicket of willows on the creek bank, May watched. She had disobeyed him. The moment he rode out of sight, a fear more powerful than her promise to stay put had seized her. She couldn't let him face them alone. She had followed on foot, keeping to the woods, her heart pounding with every step. She had seen him enter the sheriff's office, and a few minutes later, she saw the stranger follow him in. She knew, with the chilling certainty of a hunted animal, that it was a trap. She waited, her terror a living thing in her throat. Nearly an hour passed. Then the back door of the office opened. Miller and the stranger dragged Eli's limp body out, slung him over the back of a horse like a sack of grain, and led him toward the edge of town, to the dilapidated abandoned livery stable that had been boarded up for years. Tears of helpless fury and terror streamed down May's face. Her first instinct was to run, to flee back to the cave and the empty safety it offered. But the thought of Eli, beaten and alone in that dark place, stopped her. The image of Josiah's sacrifice flashed in her mind, and the memory of Eli's voice, raw and fierce in the ravine. You're the one I've chosen to keep. Something inside her shifted. The trembling, terrified girl who had collapsed in the snow began to recede, pushed aside by a cold, hard resolve she never knew she possessed. They had taken everything from her. They would not take him. She didn't have a plan, not a real one. It was a desperate improvisation born of love and necessity. She made her way back to Josiah's smithy. The place was silent, a tomb. She found what she was looking for in the small living quarters. A dark, plain dress of Josiah's late wife, a severe bonnet, and a basket. She filled a few empty bottles with water tinted by herbs from the garden. In a small chest, she found a tin of salve. She was no longer May, the runaway. She was a traveling peddler of remedies and poultices, a common sight on the frontier, a woman no one would look at twice. She walked into town as dusk began to fall, forcing her steps to be steady, her head held high. She approached the old livery, her heart hammering against her ribs. As expected, a single guard sat on a stool by the main door, a rifle across his lap. He was a local thug she recognized from town, a man named Cletus. She approached him, offering a weary but pleasant smile. "Good evening to you, sir. A long road I've traveled today." She held up a small bottle of dark liquid. "Perhaps a man like yourself could use a little something to ward off the night chill. A special elixir from my own recipe. Warms the blood and eases the mind." Cletus eyed her suspiciously. Then his gaze lingered on the bottle. "What's it cost?" "For a man doing such an important job, the first taste is a gift," she said, her voice smooth and practiced. It was a voice she had heard the shepherd use 1,000 times, a voice of false sincerity. She uncorked the bottle. It was mostly water, but she'd had the foresight to add the last of Eli's whiskey to it, giving it a powerful scent. The guard took the bottle, sniffed it, and took a long swallow. His eyes lit up. "That's got some kick to it." "It surely does," May said, her hands trembling inside the basket. "Eases a man right into a peaceful state." While he was distracted by the potent drink, her eyes darted around, spotting a rusty side window, its latch loose. A desperate idea formed. She thanked the man and moved on, circling the building in the deepening twilight. With trembling fingers, she worked the rusty latch free and slipped through the narrow opening, landing silently on the hay-strewn floor inside. The stable was dark and smelled of decay and dust. In the faint light from a grimy window, she saw him. He was in an empty horse stall, his hands bound to a post, his head slumped on his chest. A dark stain of dried blood matted his hair. "Eli," she whispered, rushing to his side. He stirred, his head coming up slowly. His eyes were unfocused, but they cleared when they saw her. "May, what? How?" "There's no time," she said, her fingers fumbling with the thick ropes around his wrists. "I saw them take you." The knots were tight, unyielding. In desperation, she pulled Josiah's heavy revolver from the pocket of her dress. Using the sharp front sight of the pistol, she began sawing at the thick rope fibers. It was agonizingly slow work. Finally, the last strand parted, and his hands were free. He slumped against her, his body a dead weight. "We have to go," she urged, helping him to his feet. They were halfway to the side window when the main door creaked open. The man who had been with the sheriff stood silhouetted in the doorway. Well, look what the cat dragged in." Eli shoved May behind him, his body a weak but determined shield. He was unarmed, swaying on his feet. The man advanced, drawing his pistol, a cruel smile on his face. But as he stepped forward, he didn't see the broken floorboard in the shadows. His foot went through, and he stumbled with a curse. It was the only chance they would get. Eli launched himself forward, a primal roar tearing from his throat. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs. The man was stronger, but Eli was fighting with the fury of a cornered grizzly. He grabbed the man's gun hand, slamming it again and again against the stone floor until the pistol clattered away. The man rolled, pulling a long knife from his boot. He lunged, but Eli was ready. He caught the man's wrist, turning the blade back on him. For a moment they were locked in a desperate, grunting stalemate. Then, with a final, explosive effort, Eli drove the knife home. The man stiffened, a look of shock on his face, before slumping to the floor. Gasping for breath, Eli staggered back. He looked down at the still figure, then at May. "Let's go," he rasped. as they scrambled for the door. May's eyes fell on a leather pouch on the dead man's belt, thinking it might contain money. She grabbed it. They burst out of the stable and melted into the darkness of the woods behind the town, leaving the dead man and the sleeping guard behind. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of their hiding place. Under the pale light of the moon, Eli, his head throbbing, opened the leather pouch May had taken. It wasn't money. Inside was a folded, hand-drawn map. It showed the surrounding territories, with a single spot circled in red ink. A remote, abandoned mission deep in the Badlands. Beside the circle were 3 words, scrawled in a precise, chilling hand. Asterisk, the penitent's fold, asterisk. And below that, a list of names. All of them female. Sarah, Lily, and a dozen others. Eli looked at May, the map trembling in his hand. This wasn't just a ledger, it was a cage. This was where they kept them. This was where they held the other girls. In that moment, everything changed. Their desperate flight for survival was over. A new, terrible purpose had been thrust upon them. It was no longer enough to just live. They had to make sure justice was done. The map was a death warrant in Eli's hand. It was also their only weapon. To run to the Badlands, to the so-called penitent's fold asterisk, would be to walk into the heart of the enemy's territory, a place from which no one returned. To flee north would only postpone the inevitable. The hunt would never stop. The only way to end it was to cut the head off the snake, here in 3 Forks. Their plan was desperate, a long shot forged in the cold moonlight, before dawn. Eli crept back to the edge of town and left a small, weighted pouch on the doorstep of the mayor's house. Inside was not the map, but the small, delicate silver chain he had pulled from May's flesh. Wrapped around it was a note, written in May's shaky but resolute hand. It was simple. Asterisk, I have the proof. All of it. The old meeting hall. Noon. Come alone and we trade the map for our lives. It was a lie, and they knew it. The men they were dealing with, Sheriff Brody Miller, the smooth-talking killer, and the unseen shepherd, did not make trades. They eliminated threats. But the note was not for them. It was for the town. Tucked into the door of Josiah's cold, silent smithy. May left a second, longer letter. In it, she told the story of Josiah's murder, named the sheriff as complicit, and described the silver chain she had left for the mayor, asterisk, if we are found dead. The letter concluded, asterisk, know that we tried to bring the truth to light. Do not let Josiah's death be for nothing. It was a seed of truth planted in scorched earth, a final, desperate hope that it might find fertile ground. The old meeting hall stood at the end of the muddy street, a skeletal, abandoned building with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. It smelled of dust and forgotten sermons. They entered through a back door minutes before noon, taking up a position in the deep shadows of the preacher's raised pulpit. Eli held the Winchester, its cold wooden stock a familiar comfort. May clutched Josiah's heavy Colt, her two-handed grip steady, her knuckles white. The frightened girl was gone, replaced by a woman forged in fire and ice. They came exactly at noon. The front doors groaned open, spilling dusty shafts of light into the gloom. 3 figures entered. Sheriff Miller, his star a tarnished mockery on his chest. A portly, sweating man Eli recognized as Mayor Thompson, and between them, a man who radiated an aura of absolute authority. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a severe black coat, with piercing blue eyes and a face that was both handsome and cruel. This was the shepherd, Brother Gideon. You have something that belongs to me, Gideon said, his voice calm and resonant, filling the empty hall. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. Eli stepped out from the shadows, the Winchester held casually but ready. It belongs to her, he said, nodding toward May, who remained half hidden by the pulpit. And you're going to let us walk away. or this map and everything on it goes to a federal marshal." Gideon smiled, a thin, chilling expression. "You are a fool. You believe you are in a position to bargain?" He looked past Eli, toward May. "My child," he said, his voice dripping with a possessive, paternalistic poison. "You are lost. You have fallen into the hands of a violent man. Come back to the light, confess your sins, and you will be forgiven." May stepped fully into view then, the heavy revolver held level, aimed directly at his heart. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear and cold as a winter river. "I have nothing to confess to you," she said, "but you will answer for Sarah, and for Lily, and for Josiah." The mayor flinched at the names, but Gideon's smile never wavered. "Such spirit, I cultivated that in you. A pity it has been turned to such wicked ends." He turned his attention back to Eli. "Give me the map. We will be merciful. A quick end is more than you deserve." "And if I don't?" Eli challenged. Sheriff Miller answered by drawing his pistol. "Then we'll take it off your corpse." As he spoke, the side doors of the hall creaked open. 4 more men, hard-faced thugs from the town saloon, stepped inside, rifles in their hands. They were surrounded. The trap had been sprung. "This is the end of the road, son," Miller sneered. It was in that moment, when the air was thick with the promise of death and all hope seemed lost, that the great front doors of the hall were thrown open with a thunderous crash. Light flooded the room, silhouetting a crowd of figures. At the forefront was Silas Henderson, the sour-faced storekeeper, holding a shotgun. Beside him stood other men Eli recognized. Ranchers, a blacksmith from the next town over, men who had known and respected Josiah. They were armed with hunting rifles, pistols, and a cold, grim fury. "Miller!" Silas roared, his voice shaking with righteous anger. "We found the girl's letter. We found Josiah's blood in the pass. Your time playing king in this town is over." For a heartbeat, the hall was frozen in a tense tableau. Then Gideon gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod, and all hell broke loose. The hall erupted in a deafening cacophony of gunfire. Black powder smoke instantly filled the air, acrid and blinding. Eli shoved May behind the heavy oak pulpit as bullets splintered the wood around them. He fired back, his shots methodical, aimed, taking down one of the thugs at the side door. May, her ears ringing, rose from her crouch and fired Josiah's Colt. The recoil jolted her arm, but she saw one of the men aiming at Silas go down, clutching his shoulder. This was not a fight for survival anymore. It was a war for justice. The townsfolk charged in, their own guns blazing, turning the one-sided trap into a chaotic, swirling melee. Through the shifting clouds of smoke, Eli saw Miller trying to make a break for the back. He vaulted over the pulpit railing, tackling the sheriff in a diving crash of bodies. They rolled on the dusty floor, grappling for Miller's pistol. Eli's head wound throbbed, but he fought with a desperate strength, finally wrenching the gun free and slamming the sheriff's head against the floorboards, knocking him unconscious. Across the room, May faced her demon. Brother Gideon, his calm facade finally shattered, was trying to escape through a side door. She ran to intercept him, her gun empty. He turned on her, his face a mask of fury, a derringer appearing in his hand. But before he could fire, a heavy shape flew through the air and struck him in the chest. It was the church's heavy leather-bound Bible, thrown by Silas. Gideon staggered back, and May launched herself at him, not with a weapon, but with the full force of her body, sending them both crashing to the floor. She ripped the derringer from his grasp and stood over him, her chest heaving. Finally free. The gunfire subsided, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the ringing in their ears. The smoke began to clear, the afternoon sun streaming through the bullet-pocked walls, illuminating the scene of carnage. The thugs were captured or dead. Mayor Thompson was on his knees, weeping and begging for his life. Sheriff Miller was bound and gagged, and Brother Gideon, the shepherd, lay on the floor, his power broken, looking up at the girl he had once owned with eyes full of disbelief and hatred. Justice had come to Three Forks. The snows melted, and a fragile green spring crept over the land. The world was being reborn, and so were they. They didn't stay to see the federal marshals arrive, nor did they listen to the grateful thanks of the townspeople. They had not fought for thanks. They had fought for the dead and for the living. They rode out of town one morning on 2 horses, Martha and Josiah's big roan, their few possessions bundled behind them. They didn't look back. The town and its ghosts were behind them. Ahead lay the vast, open country, a wilderness that promised nothing but a chance to be. They stopped on a high prairie, the air sweet with the scent of new grass and a riot of purple and yellow wildflowers. The sky was a vast, clean blue. It was a world of possibility. May looked at Eli, her eyes clear and bright, the last of the shadows finally chased away by the sun. "You don't have to run anymore," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He reached out, his hand gently touching the side of her face. "And I will never let anyone stitch you up again, for any reason." It was not a promise of a life without hardship, or a vow of eternal love. It was something more real, more vital. It was a promise of safety, a promise of freedom. She leaned into his touch, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Together, they urged their horses forward, riding side by side into the wild, open heart of the West, where their love, forged in winter and violence, had finally found its spring. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the Wild West campfire. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed the tale, please consider subscribing to Wild West Campfire and sharing your thoughts. We'll see you for the next one.